The dawn broke with a brittle clarity, the first light cutting through the mist that still clung to the low fields of Thornhill Plantation. The plantation seemed to stir reluctantly, as if the earth itself sensed the tension that would define the day. Horses stamped in their stalls, servants moved with quiet urgency, and the visiting planters began arriving, their polished boots sinking slightly in the dew-darkened earth. Each familiar clatter, each cheerful greeting, each crack of a whip on a restless hound struck through me like a pulse of forewarning. Tomorrow or today, if one were precise, the long reckoning would arrive. I moved through my morning duties with the automatic grace of someone who had practiced concealment and restraint for years. My hands polished silverware, arranged breakfast trays, and swept the veranda as if each motion were mere routine. Yet beneath the mechanical exterior, my mind rehearsed the unfolding of my plan again and again. Thornhill would rise that day, unaware that the calm in his household masked a storm specifically crafted for him. My fingers brushed the lip of a coffee cup and lingered, noting how pale he had looked when he had sipped the last of Samuel's poison the previous evening. The memory of Joseph's final agonized cries echoed in the corners of my mind, and I breathed, steadying myself. Tomorrow, justice would have a face, and it would be his. When I entered the main house to deliver Thornhill's morning coffee, he looked up from the paper, his features slightly slack, dark circles under his eyes. He attempted to straighten, to present the prideful authority he always carried, but it faltered. "Are you certain you're up to the hunt today, sir?" I asked, letting my concern sound natural, a mask concealing the anticipation beneath. "You seem a bit piqued." He waved me off, his voice snapping with irritation but betraying the weariness in his posture. "I'm fine. Nothing a day in the saddle won't cure. Fresh air and good sport, that's the ticket." "Yes, sir, of course," I replied, bobbing a careful curtsy. My heart beat a rapid drum against my ribs, but my face betrayed nothing. I left him to his poisoned cup, watching the smoke curl in faint spirals from the china, knowing each sip carried him closer to the weakness that would make my plan possible. By mid-morning, the north lawn teemed with life. Horns sounded in the distance, and foxhounds barked in frenzied anticipation, their excitement mirrored in the jockeying of men and horses alike. Fine coats and polished boots cut stark contrast against the rugged earth and humble cabins that housed the plantation's slaves. All around me, the world went about the facade of leisure and sport, unaware of the dark design lurking beneath it. Off to the side, set apart from the cheerful chaos of the fox hunt, the temporary kennels held Thornhill's prized mastiffs. Massive and impressive, the dogs shifted restlessly in their cages, their senses alert, muscles coiled like springs. Reed appeared beside the kennels, scanning the gathering guests and the animals with the imperious air he always carried. Catching sight of me, he beckoned sharply. "Girl, Martha, get over here. You've been handling these beasts, might as well make yourself useful for the demonstration later." I approached, my steps careful, measured, heart thundering so loudly I feared it might betray my presence. "Yes, sir," I said, concealing the storm within. Reed's eyes, sharp and calculating, scanned me briefly, perhaps sensing only competence. "Master Thornhill wants to show these dogs to our guests after the hunt concludes. You'll assist. Keep them calm while I explain their training and purpose," he instructed, a faint curl of malice at the edges of his lip. "Seems fitting, don't it? Your man being their last successful hunt." I lowered my gaze, hiding the hatred that flared like fire beneath my chest. "Yes, sir, as master wishes." "Good. Be at the kennels at 4 o'clock sharp. The hunt should be returning around then." He turned and strode away, leaving me with the moment to internalize what I had been handed, a perfect opportunity, unlooked for yet perfectly timed. My mind traced the sequence once more. The mastiffs, conditioned to scent Thornhill, the fog creeping in from the river, the weakened master, the command that would turn months of careful observation into vengeance. Every detail fell into place like the pieces of a deadly puzzle. As the hunt departed in a storm of hooves and baying foxhounds, I made my way toward the main kennels behind the house. There, the preparation for the evening's final conditioning awaited. Thornhill's mastiffs would dine on their master's sweat-stained garments, each bite reinforcing a scent association I had cultivated with painstaking patience. The hours passed slowly, the world outside me blurring into mere function, dusting, sweeping, folding laundry, yet my mind remained focused, circling relentlessly around the coming confrontation. Would the dogs respond as I hoped? Would I have the chance to confront Thornhill alone? Would Reed interfere? Or had Samuel calculated every contingency? These questions burned behind my eyes as fog rolled from the river, a white curtain swallowing the eastern edges of the plantation. The world seemed to bend slightly under its influence, and I felt a shiver of anticipation. An ally had arrived in the mist. By mid-afternoon, I made my way to the temporary kennels, where the mastiffs greeted me with low whines, pressing their massive heads against the bars as if sensing the excitement I carried. "Soon," I murmured to them softly, almost a whisper. "Very soon now." The first distant horn calls of returning hunters drifted over the fog, heralding the moment I had rehearsed endlessly. My chest tightened with a mixture of fear, anticipation, and grim satisfaction. Tomorrow or today it would all end. One way or another, Thornhill would taste the cruelty he had designed for others. One way or another, I would claim the measure of justice Joseph deserved. By mid-afternoon, the distant echoes of horn blasts and the baying of foxhounds signaled the hunters' return from the fields. The North Lawn, once a quiet expanse awaiting the day's excitement, had transformed into a hive of controlled chaos. Visiting planters guided their mounts with practiced ease, laughter ringing out as men recounted the chase, their polished boots pressed into the rutted earth, their coats gleaming under the thinning fog. Servants scurried to gather the horses, pat the animals down, and secure tack, but all of it seemed a secondary concern to the gentleman's exhilaration. The world had become a stage for the sport they revered, blissfully unaware that behind the veneer of leisure, a storm of vengeance was poised to strike. I remained on the periphery, hidden among the shadowed edges of the garden, watching with hawk-like focus. My chest tightened each time the mastiff's temporary kennels came into view, each step bringing me closer to the moment when patience and precision would converge. Reed's eyes flicked to me periodically, sharp and commanding. He had noticed my presence, as any overseer would, yet he made no effort to call me forward until the precise moment, confident in his assumed control. As the hunters dismounted, their excitement carried on the crisp afternoon air. I observed Thornhill move toward the kennels with an effortful grace, his face flushed from exertion. The poison had begun its work. His movements, usually confident and almost predatory, were slightly unsteady. A stumble here, a faint quiver in the hands there, small betrayals of his weakening body, but none of the planters seemed to notice. To all appearances, he was merely the master overseeing his prized animals, the epitome of authority. "Master Thornhill, sir," Reed muttered under his breath, concern creeping into his tone as he noted the slight falter. Thornhill waved him off with a dismissive gesture, masking the effort it took to stand fully upright. "Just a touch of fatigue," he insisted, his voice carrying the practiced confidence of someone unwilling to admit vulnerability. "Nothing serious." The words rang hollow to me, but to the assembled planters they sufficed. The mastiffs, meanwhile, pressed against their cages with a barely contained intensity, as if sensing the shift in the atmosphere. Their ears twitched, noses lifted, and low rumbles vibrated through their chests. Brutus, the lead dog, stood slightly apart, massive frame coiled and ready, his eyes flicking toward the door as I drew closer. I ran my hands along the cage's edge, murmuring soft encouragements, careful to maintain a guise of calm. My voice carried no hint of the command that would soon twist their instincts into agents of justice. Thornhill called to me then, the order precise, laced with pride. "Girl, open Brutus's cage. Show these gentlemen what a proper hunting dog looks like." My heart surged, the careful conditioning over weeks culminating in this single orchestrated display. I approached Brutus, fingers steady despite the storm of adrenaline within me. With a quiet click, the latch gave, and the dog emerged, massive head brushing against my side, muscles rippling with restrained power. "This is my lead dog," Thornhill announced, his chest swelling with pride. "Fastest and fiercest of the pack. Took down a runaway buck not 3 weeks ago. Tore his throat out before we could even get a rope on him." The casual cruelty of his description, the effortless recounting of violence, set my teeth on edge. His eyes glimmered with the same cold satisfaction he had shown when Joseph had fallen beneath these very jaws. The visiting planters nodded, some reaching out to pat Brutus's broad head, their admiration mingled with faint apprehension. Thornhill's voice carried over the crowd, authoritative, dismissive of any caution. "Careful there, Henderson. He's trained to attack on command. Wouldn't want to give him the wrong idea." The men laughed, stepping back slightly, but the veneer of control did not fully mask the tension in the air. The demonstration continued, Thornhill explaining the intricacies of the Mastiff's conditioning. "The key," he said, placing a hand on Brutus's head, "is proper training from the pup stage. Scent of blood becomes reward. Release them on the trail of a runaway, and they'll track him to the ends of the earth." My pulse quickened. Brutus sniffed at Thornhill's hand, posture shifting subtly as the scent I had meticulously cultivated. His sweat, his blood, his essence lingered invisibly on me and the food he had consumed. A low, subtle rumble vibrated through the dog's chest, a harbinger of the chaos yet to come. The other 5 mastiffs joined Brutus, forming a clustered, intimidating mass of muscle and teeth. Fog thickened around the plantation, reducing visibility and adding a ghostly edge to the scene. Thornhill remained oblivious, speaking with the assumed authority of a master certain of his dominion. "These dogs respond instantly to," he began, then suddenly faltered, doubling over in a sharp gasp. The poison had taken deeper hold, his complexion pale beneath the flush of exertion. Murmurs spread among the planters. Reed stepped forward, voice edged with concern. "Shall I fetch the doctor, sir?" Thornhill waved him off, insisting he only required brief rest. Reed turned to me. "Get these animals back in their cages." I nodded, outwardly compliant, but internally plotting. I took a small step backward, away from the animals and the 2 men, voice low but deliberate. "They don't seem to want to go back in their cages, sir," I said softly, measuring every syllable. Reed's hand went to the whip at his belt, brow furrowed. Both men turned to see the mastiffs now rigid, heads lowered, eyes fixed on Thornhill. A deep, menacing growl emanated from Brutus, echoed by the pack. Confusion rippled across Thornhill's face, then panic. "Call them off," he demanded, voice sharp and rising. My own voice hardened, carrying over the fog. "They know exactly what they're doing, don't they, Master Thornhill? Just like when they killed Joseph." Recognition dawned, horror and outrage flickering across his features. He tried to flee, but weakness stole his balance. My heart, though storming with vengeance, remained steady. The moment I had waited for years of grief, planning, and patient observation had arrived. The fog thickened, swallowing the edges of the plantation in a grey, ghostly haze, leaving only the figures of Thornhill, Reed, the assembled planters, and the massive mastiffs visible. Time seemed to slow, each heartbeat echoing in my ears, each breath a drawn-out instrument of anticipation. Thornhill's face, once so commanding, now twisted with confusion, disbelief, and growing panic. His hand trembled as he tried to muster authority over creatures that had been instruments of his control, now turned into agents of reckoning. "Call them off, Brutus! Heel!" he shouted, voice cracking, resonant with fear he had never known before. The words, meant to restore order, fell on ears attuned only to the scent of vengeance. The mastiffs did not flinch, did not obey. Brutus's low growl rose into a feral snarl, echoing in the fog like thunder, while the others mirrored him, bodies coiled, muscles taut, eyes gleaming with lethal focus. Their loyalty had been reshaped, redirected by the very hand Thornhill had once scorned. Reed, stepping forward, whip in hand, sought to regain control. "Step back, girl, call them off," he barked, voice authoritative but now tinged with fear. The whip cracked through the humid air, sharp and commanding, yet even this was powerless. Brutus shifted, intercepting Reed's approach, teeth bared, and a warning growl reverberated from deep within his chest. Reed froze, realizing too late that he was facing the consequence of his master's cruelty, now administered by the very creatures designed to enforce it. I stepped back into the obscuring fog, voice steady, the weight of months of grief and planning channeled into one deliberate act. "I don't think I will," I said softly, the words carrying across the plantation like a whisper of destiny. Every eye now found me, and horror flickered in the planters' expressions as understanding began to settle over them. Thornhill's pallor deepened as recognition of his imminent fate took hold. The command that would have triggered obedience in the dogs hung in the air, unspoken until the moment was absolute. My breath came in controlled waves, every muscle coiled in readiness. The memories of Joseph, his struggle, his screams, the helplessness I had felt fueled the final surge of resolve. Thornhill's weakness, the poison coursing through him, ensured he could not flee or rally. He was exposed, vulnerable, at the mercy of forces he had thought he controlled. Time fractured. A single word, shouted into the thick fog, became the instrument of final reckoning. "Havoc!" I cried, voice cutting through the haze like a blade. The effect was instantaneous. Brutus lunged first, massive paws crushing the earth, teeth finding their target with precision, honed by months of training. The other mastiffs followed, a tide of power and fury, enveloping Thornhill as he stumbled, grasping futilely at Reed's arm, seeking support from a man who could no longer command the outcome. Screams erupted, high-pitched and desperate, mingling with the growls and snapping jaws of the mastiffs. Thornhill's cries were agonizingly familiar, echoing the horror of Joseph's final moments. Panic rippled through the planters as they attempted to intervene, some raising whips, some brandishing walking sticks, but none could match the precision and ferocity of the 6 massive dogs now fully unleashed. 2 mastiffs diverted toward Reed, jaws closing on their former handler, and the overseer fell, a single, sickening crack, signaling the end of his futile struggle. I watched, heart pounding yet steady, as Thornhill was driven to his knees, his final moments a mirrored horror of the death he had orchestrated for others. Flesh was torn, his proud hunting garments shredded, and the mask of authority he had worn so long was gone, replaced by raw terror. Each bite, each growl, each surge of primal power reflected the culmination of months of careful preparation, the blood of the master paying homage to the blood of the husband he had slain. Amidst the chaos, the fog became my ally. I slipped backward, retreating into the obscuring grey, my figure melting into the shadows. The baying and snarling continued behind me, but I did not linger to witness the end in detail. It was enough to know that vengeance had been served, that the mastiffs, once instruments of cruelty, had enacted the justice I had sought with patient, unwavering resolve. The planters' shouts, the panicked scrambling, the terrified calls of servants became distant echoes as I moved further into the woods, heart still hammering, lungs burning from both exertion and adrenaline. The North Star, a faint, steady beacon through the dissipating fog, offered a guide. Every step carried me further from the plantation, from the scene of horror, and toward a life I had only dared to imagine. As I ran, I allowed a small private smile to surface. The symmetry of justice so long denied, so painfully delayed, had been realized. Thornhill had fallen as Joseph had, a brutal reflection of the cruelty he had so casually commanded. The mastiffs, instruments of death, had been released from the perversion of their training and found a new purpose in executing vengeance upon the one who had corrupted them. I did not stop until darkness fully claimed the woods, until the distant chaos was muffled to nothing. Every footstep carried me farther from the plantation and closer to freedom. I thought of Joseph with each step, his memory a fuel for my determination. Though his body lay at Thornhill Plantation, torn as the master's would now be, his spirit accompanied me northward, guiding, sustaining, reminding me of the promise of liberation. By dawn, I had crossed the ridge that marked unfamiliar territory, a valley stretching beneath me where no overseer, no hound, no white man could immediately reach. Exhaustion pressed heavily on me, but the knowledge of the master's fall and the precision of my vengeance carried a strange lightness, a relief that was almost alien after so long weighed down by grief and oppression. I was alone, yes, but no longer under the shadow of fear or memory. I paused atop the ridge, eyes fixed on the path north, tracing the trajectory that Samuel had taught me. The Ohio River awaited, the threshold to a life unconstrained by the chains that had bound me and the memories that had haunted me. Every instinct, every lesson learned in the house and the fields, converged in this singular pursuit, survival and freedom. Behind me, the echoes of Thornhill's demise would spread, whispers that would shape the myth of his final moments. But for me, the story was not one of legend. It was proof of agency, of patience, of courage harnessed to righteous, terrible ends. I had enacted justice, and now the journey of survival and liberation could truly begin. The fog thinned gradually as night deepened, leaving the woods cloaked in a damp silver darkness. Each step I took was measured, deliberate, avoiding the cracks of dry branches that might betray my presence. My lungs burned from running, legs heavy with exhaustion, but there was no room to pause, not yet. The baying of the foxhounds from the hunt, distant now but sharp against the quiet of the trees, reminded me that pursuit was inevitable. These were not Thornhill's mastiffs, the instruments of vengeance I had carefully manipulated. These were the hounds of the visiting planters, bred and trained to track fleeing humans, to follow scent with relentless accuracy. I was their quarry, and the stakes were my life. Memories of Joseph surged with each careful step. His face flashed before me, eyes wide with terror the night he had been torn apart by those same dogs, and grief threatened to overwhelm me. I clamped down on it, forcing the pain into a cold focus. Joseph's death had ignited the fire that now propelled me forward. Each step northward was a promise to him, to myself, to the future that might still be seized from the jaws of the world that had sought to claim us both. I navigated the uneven ground, roots and rocks threatening to trip my feet. Samuel's instructions repeated in my mind like a mantra. Move by night, hide by day, trust the stars, cross water to confuse your scent. He had taught me more than escape tactics. He had taught me patience, foresight, the small, vital actions that distinguish survival from capture. I followed his wisdom instinctively, slipping into the shadows, ducking beneath low branches, pausing only when I heard a rustle that might be human or hound. A shallow stream appeared in the distance, moonlight glinting off its surface. The water would serve two purposes. It would obscure my scent and give me a brief, if temporary, relief from the physical strain of running. I approached silently, feet careful not to disturb the bank. Once in the stream, I waded slowly, the cold biting at my calves, sending shivers up my spine. Each step carried me hundreds of yards downstream before I climbed onto the opposite bank, pressing myself against a tree to catch my breath. The distant barking of the hounds faded into the night, replaced by the whispering of wind through the pines and the occasional cry of a night bird. I allowed myself a brief moment to consider the magnitude of what I had done. Thornhill was dead, exacting justice on the man who had ordered Joseph's death, and the mastiffs, instruments of cruelty, had been turned into instruments of vengeance. Yet there was no triumph in lingering. Survival demanded constant motion. I straightened, tightening the thin cloak around my shoulders, and began again, following the path Samuel had indicated toward the North Star. The woods were a maze of shadows and indistinct shapes, but I had learned to read them over years of servitude. My eyes adjusted to the faint light, to the subtle shifts of the wind, to the echoes of movement that hinted at hidden dangers. Each step was cautious, but I maintained a steady pace, knowing that any stumble could cost me dearly. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig was assessed instantly, every decision weighted with the possibility of life or death. By early morning, I reached a small clearing atop a low ridge, and for the first time, the stars were fully visible. I found the North Star without hesitation, a constant guide in the uncertainty of the night. Its steady brilliance reminded me of the countless runaways who had found their way before me, the generations who had resisted, fled, and survived. I whispered Joseph's name under my breath, a silent vow to continue forward, to honor his memory not only through vengeance but through the pursuit of freedom itself. The day began to stir around me, the light creeping over the horizon, and I sought immediate concealment. A thick copse of evergreens provided shadow and cover, and I pressed myself to the ground, waiting while the sun rose. My body ached, my muscles protested, but I dared not sleep. I used the time to inspect my supplies, a small bundle of belongings I had managed to carry, including the wooden carving Joseph had made, the token of our bond, and a few rations I had taken from the plantation. The carving, two birds in flight, felt heavier than its size suggested, weighted with memory, grief, and hope. Throughout the morning, I moved in short, careful bursts, always keeping the North Star in sight when possible. I avoided open roads, circled around farms, and navigated the streams and valleys that would slow any pursuers. I remembered Samuel's lessons: leave false trails, cross water to break scent, blend with the terrain. At one point I paused near a marshy area to smear mud on my shoes, erasing tracks, knowing the hounds' noses would be confounded by the scent of the earth. By midday, fatigue pressed upon me in waves, but I forced movement, each step a testament to months of planning, years of endurance, and the unyielding desire for freedom. I drank sparingly from streams, mindful of the need to maintain strength without revealing my presence. The sounds of distant life, the occasional crow, the rustle of cattle, the faint hum of human voices were reminders of the world I had left behind, a world where my body and will were never my own. Evening approached, and with it came the promise of concealment under darkness once more. I found a secluded grove, thick with pines and shaded by moss-draped branches, and pressed myself into a small hollow beneath a fallen tree. Here I rested briefly, muscles trembling with exhaustion, but ever alert, aware of the necessity to awaken and move once darkness returned. I allowed my mind to wander, if only for a moment, to imagine the Ohio River, the final barrier to the lands of freedom Samuel had promised. I imagined the river's wide, dark expanse, the boats and ferries, the crossing that would take me beyond the reach of the men who would hunt me. Though fear lingered, fear of capture, of discovery, of the unpredictable cruelty of those who would see me return to bondage, it was tempered by an unfamiliar sensation, hope. For the first time in years, I could imagine a life not dictated by the whims of masters, a life where the only commands were my own, where survival was not measured in obedience but in choice. As darkness fell again, I rose, body weary but spirit undiminished. I would move through the night toward the river, guided by stars and the faint, whispered directions Samuel had given me. Each step northward was a step toward freedom, a reclamation of life stolen, a silent tribute to Joseph and to the countless unnamed souls who had endured, resisted, and persevered. The journey was far from over, but the first critical mile had been achieved. The fog and the forest had concealed me, the dogs had done their work, and vengeance had been fulfilled. Now, the path forward was solely my own to navigate, fraught with danger, yet illuminated by the faint, steadfast light of hope. And I moved forward, resolute, toward the life that awaited beyond the reach of slavery, beyond the shadow of Thornhill Plantation, into the uncertain but precious promise of freedom. The night was heavy with the scent of damp earth, the air thick with fog lingering from the river's edge. I had navigated through dense woods and shallow streams, my body bruised and aching, but every step northward brought me closer to the Ohio River, the line between bondage and freedom. The stars were partially veiled by drifting clouds, yet I could still discern the North Star, its steady light a guiding hand through the oppressive darkness. Every rustle, every distant howl, every snap of twig reminded me that I was not yet safe. Pursuers might be nearby, and the hounds from the plantation were trained relentlessly. I had to remain silent, invisible, an extension of the shadows. When I first glimpsed the broad sweep of the Ohio, a sense of awe and fear collided in my chest. The river glimmered faintly under the faint moonlight, wide and dark, the current swift and unrelenting. Crossing it would mean leaving the known world of Georgia behind, stepping into territories where freedom was tangible, yet untested. My pulse raced at the realization that this was the moment I had long prepared for. Months of whispered planning, Samuel's lessons, and endless vigilance distilled into a single act of courage. I crouched behind a thick copse of riverbank willows, listening. The water lapped gently at the shore, masking other noises, but every sense was alert to movement beyond my vision. Shadows shifted among the reeds, possibly night animals, possibly human eyes searching for me. I waited until I was certain the immediate area was clear before moving closer to the water, every footfall deliberate, every breath measured. Samuel's instructions echoed in my mind. Wait for darkness to deepen, and then move like a ghost. Trust the currents, trust the ferryman, and trust your own instincts. I scanned the riverbank, eyes adjusting to the dim light, until a small boat appeared, tethered loosely to a post, nearly hidden beneath a tangle of brush. A man's silhouette emerged briefly, silent and watchful. This must be the ferryman Samuel had spoken of, a free black man risking his own liberty to ferry runaways across the river. Relief, tempered with caution, surged through me. I approached the boat slowly, crouching low, keeping the brush between us. The ferryman's gaze met mine briefly, sharp and assessing, before he gestured with a subtle nod. "Quietly," he whispered, voice low and steady. "Step in and stay low. The current is strong tonight." I obeyed, stepping into the small vessel with trembling hands, clutching the wooden carving Joseph had made as if it were a talisman against the dangers of the world. The ferryman pushed off, his movements smooth, practiced, the boat gliding over the river's dark surface. The river was alive with sound, the rush of the current, the creak of the boat, the distant call of night birds, and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface. I kept my head low, ears straining, heart hammering. Every ripple felt like a test, every shadow a potential threat. I thought of Thornhill and his mastiffs, of Joseph's final moments, and of the narrow, unyielding path that had brought me here. Vengeance had been fulfilled, but survival was an even more delicate task. One mistake could undo everything. As the ferry pushed toward the opposite shore, the ferryman murmured advice, his voice almost lost in the river's murmur. "Once you land, follow the ridge east. There's a safe house 2 miles ahead, hidden behind a grove. A family of free blacks will shelter you. No one asks questions, no one keeps records. Move swiftly, but do not run recklessly. The woods are full of those who would see you returned." I nodded silently, committing every word to memory. The Ohio was a line I would cross, but the journey north did not end here. Freedom required vigilance, cunning, and patience. The boat scraped the opposite bank, and I leapt out, boots sinking slightly into the wet soil. The ferryman's hand steadied me briefly, and with a final nod, he melted back into the shadows, leaving me alone in the alien landscape of northern woods. I adjusted the bundle of belongings on my back and pressed forward along the ridge, moving as Samuel had taught, blending with the shadows, each step a careful negotiation with the earth beneath me. Soon, I glimpsed the faint light of the safe house through the trees, a small log cabin, modest yet welcoming in its quiet presence. I approached cautiously, every nerve alert, every sense attuned to danger. Inside, a woman greeted me quietly, ushering me into the warmth of the hearth. Smoke from a cooking fire filled the small room, mingling with the scent of baked bread and herbs, a comfort I had not felt in years. The woman's hands were steady, skilled, her eyes calm yet watchful. She guided me to a bed of blankets and insisted I eat before speaking. The simplicity of the act, food offered without fear or hierarchy, brought tears to my eyes. As I ate, she spoke softly, confirming what Samuel had told me. The Underground Railroad was a network of hidden paths, safe houses, and allies who moved unseen beneath the surface of free states. Those who helped me risked everything, yet they did so with an unspoken moral certainty, a quiet defiance of the cruel structures that sought to claim lives and liberty. I realized that freedom was not a single act, but a chain of choices, each reliant on the courage and integrity of others. I slept for the first time in days, curled in the corner of the cabin, yet sleep was light, punctuated by dreams of Thornhill's mastiffs, the rushing river, and Joseph's face. I awoke at dawn, renewed yet aware that my journey had only begun. The woman provided fresh clothes, a bundle of rations, and whispered directions to the next safe house, farther north, closer to Canada, closer to the land where slavery could not reach me. As I stepped back into the woods, I felt a strange blend of exhilaration and apprehension. The Ohio River was behind me, its dark waters a boundary I had crossed, a final barrier between the life of a slave and the life I would now create. The woods stretched ahead, dense and unknowable, yet filled with promise. The trail was still perilous, but for the first time, hope was a tangible companion. I moved silently, following the guidance of Samuel's instructions, trusting in the generosity of strangers, and relying on instincts honed by years of survival. Each mile north was a reclamation of agency, a step toward a world where my body, my choices, and my will were no longer owned by another. And though the river's shadow would always remain in my memory, it was now a symbol of possibility, of the threshold I had crossed, and of the freedom that awaited just beyond the horizon. By nightfall, I arrived at the next waypoint, another modest cabin tucked deep within the forest. Here, I would rest briefly before continuing north, ever vigilant, ever determined. The journey was far from over, but the Ohio had been conquered, and with it, the first tangible taste of freedom. My path was uncertain, my body weary, but my spirit was unbroken. I had crossed the river, survived the night, and remained unclaimed. The North Star still shone above me, unwavering, guiding my steps toward a new life where vengeance had ended and liberation had begun. The morning sun crept slowly over the horizon as I emerged from the safe house, stepping into a landscape untainted by the chains of Georgia. The forest here was denser, the air crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wildflowers, a world entirely removed from the suffocating heat and cruelty of the South. Each step I took northward felt lighter than the last, as if the very soil beneath my feet whispered promises of a new beginning. Yet, even in this freedom, caution remained my constant companion. Danger lurked in shadows, even in lands where laws were meant to protect liberty. The network of safe houses extended deep into the northern states, each offering a brief reprieve and a chance to gather sustenance before moving on. I traveled mostly at night, guided by the North Star, and hidden during the day, resting beneath trees or in the attics and cellars of strangers who had pledged themselves to the cause. Their quiet courage astonished me. Some were free blacks, others sympathetic whites, yet all risked arrest or worse to aid strangers like me. Each encounter strengthened my resolve. Every act of kindness, every whispered instruction, every hidden hand guiding me further north was a reminder that freedom was not just an abstract idea, it was a tangible possibility. By the time I crossed into Canada, a sense of profound relief settled over me, tempered by the fatigue of weeks spent in relentless motion. The first town I reached was a small settlement of former slaves and free blacks near Toronto. Its narrow streets were lined with modest homes, gardens spilling into the paths, children playing freely without fear, women tending to their chores, and men working the land with quiet pride. Here, slavery was a distant memory, a shadow that could no longer reach across borders to claim bodies or will. I found work as a cook in a modest boarding house, a role that utilized the skills I had honed in Thornhill's kitchen. The rhythm of the kitchen was both familiar and liberating. No overseer's eyes scrutinized my every motion, no lash threatened for the slightest misstep. I chopped, stirred, and baked with precision, taking comfort in the control I wielded over this small essential domain. The wages I earned were mine alone, the food I cooked nourished others, and I began to feel a sense of ownership over my own existence. Though I was surrounded by others who understood the journey I had undertaken, I remained cautious with the story of Thornhill and the Mastiffs. Some secrets were too dangerous to tell, and some wounds too fresh to expose. I learned to smile politely, to laugh lightly, to speak of the weather or the market, while keeping the sharp edges of my past carefully hidden. Yet, even in silence, the memory of Joseph was a constant presence, a gentle tether to the life I had lost and the vengeance I had enacted. Months passed in this new life, each day weaving a tapestry of routine and quiet contentment. I learned to navigate the settlement, to recognize the safe houses, to make connections that would ensure my security. The community of freed blacks shared their knowledge generously: how to procure work, how to move safely through towns, how to communicate discreetly with those still enslaved to the South. Each lesson was a thread in the net of freedom that would shield me from capture and provide the foundation for a life reclaimed. News from the South arrived sporadically, carried by sympathetic travelers and letters smuggled discreetly through the network. I learned that Thornhill's widow had sold the plantation, unable to endure the legacy of her husband's gruesome death. The remaining mastiffs had been destroyed, deemed too dangerous to exist, and the slave quarters had been burned, whether by accident or deliberate vengeance. The stories varied. Each tidbit of information was a confirmation that the past had shifted irreversibly, that the instruments of cruelty had been dismantled, and that my intervention had left a permanent mark. Life, however, was not solely defined by the ghosts of Georgia. Over time, I formed tentative bonds within the community, friendships based on shared experience and mutual understanding. I learned to laugh without fear, to rest without constant vigilance, to savor the small freedoms I had long been denied. Yet even in moments of relative peace, Joseph's memory remained vivid, a reminder of love, loss, and the path that had led me to this place. 3 years after my arrival in Canada, news reached me of old Samuel's death. He had passed peacefully, quietly, within the same plantation he had helped me escape. He had taken his role in Thornhill's death and my liberation to the grave, as he had always intended. I mourned him quietly, adding his name to my nightly prayers alongside Joseph's, acknowledging the debt I owed to the man who had equipped me with the means to avenge, survive, and ultimately thrive. 5 years into this new life, I met Frederick, an escaped slave from Virginia. He was cautious, measured, with a quiet strength that reminded me painfully and sweetly of Joseph. Slowly, carefully, our friendship grew into trust, and trust blossomed into affection. Frederick's presence offered a tentative hope, a possibility that love could exist beyond the shadow of cruelty and loss. When he proposed marriage, I hesitated. Could I allow my heart to heal enough to love again, to risk vulnerability after all I had endured? But his words, full of understanding and patience, guided me to say yes. Our marriage was simple, yet profound. Friends from the settlement witnessed our vows, their quiet support a reflection of the communal resilience that had carried us all through hardship. I felt Joseph's presence as a gentle benediction, affirming that while the past could not be undone, new life and new joy were possible. Frederick never pressed for details of my escape. He understood that some stories were too heavy to share fully, that some truths demanded discretion for survival and peace. Yet one night, under the patter of rain against our roof, I found the courage to recount my journey, the vengeance I had enacted, the meticulous orchestration of Thornhill's death, and the freedom it had allowed me to claim. Frederick listened without judgment, offering the only support I truly needed, unwavering presence and quiet understanding. In telling him, I felt the weight of secrecy lift slightly, the shadow of past horror diminished by shared acknowledgement. My tears flowed freely for Joseph, for Samuel, for the woman I had been, and for the life I had reclaimed. Frederick held me through the storm of grief, letting the rain outside mirror the cleansing within. When morning came, I felt lighter, still bearing the memory of the choices I had made, yet fortified by love and acceptance. The settlement itself became a sanctuary, a place where my children, born free, could know the sun and the soil untainted by the whip or auction block. They would learn of slavery through stories of courage and resilience, not through lived terror. And when the time came, I would tell them of Joseph, of the dogs, of the vengeance that shaped my path, not to burden them, but to teach them that freedom is precious, hard-won, and sometimes demands unimaginable courage. Years passed in the quiet rhythms of Canadian life, each season marking another layer of peace slowly settling over me. The settlement around Toronto thrived quietly, a haven for those who had clawed their way from bondage into freedom. Children ran through the streets without fear of overseers, women spoke with authority over homes and gardens, men worked the soil with pride, and I, Martha, once a widow cloaked in grief and vengeance, became a figure known to a few, respected for my skill in the kitchen, my caution, and my quiet determination to survive. Frederick and I built a life together on the outskirts of the settlement, a modest house with a small garden and a porch that caught the morning sunday. Here, in this home of our own making, I began to understand that freedom carried not only relief but responsibility. The careful tending of family, of self, of legacy. Our children, born in safety, brought with them the boundless promise of lives unchained. Their laughter was a balm, their questions a bridge to a future I had never dared imagine. Yet, even in these moments of domestic peace, the memory of Joseph lingered, not as a shadow, but as a compass, guiding my decisions and shaping the woman I had become. I told Frederick fragments of my past, the dangers, the escape, the plan that had brought Thornhill's downfall, though never the full intricacies. Some things, I knew, were meant to remain unspoken, locked behind a door of silence that even love could not force open. Yet in our quiet evenings, as the rain tapped against the roof, the stories I did share forged a bond of understanding that transcended words. He held me in those moments not to absolve, but to acknowledge, letting the weight of memory find solace in shared presence. Raising children in freedom was an education in patience, vigilance, and hope. I taught them the names of stars, the North Star among them, just as Joseph had shown me. I taught them the value of hard work, the dignity of labor, and the importance of justice, even when the world denied it. Stories of courage and resistance formed the core of our evenings, tales of ancestors who had dared to defy chains, who had struck back at cruelty with ingenuity and unflinching resolve. When the children asked about Joseph, I spoke softly, carefully, of love and bravery, of dreams deferred and lives reclaimed, letting them know that freedom is built not in a single night, but over a lifetime of courage and choice. I often walked through the woods surrounding our home, tracing my fingers along the bark of trees and imagining the paths I had taken to reach this place. Memories of Thornhill Plantation, its heat, the baying of dogs, the terror of overseers rose unbidden, but now they were tempered by the certainty of justice served. I could recall the exact moment Brutus and the mastiffs obeyed the command that had cost their master his life, and rather than horror alone, there was an undercurrent of relief, a reminder that even the instruments of cruelty could be repurposed toward balance. In the evenings, Frederick and I would sit on the porch, watching our children chase fireflies across the garden. He never questioned my choices in Georgia, never judged the vengeance I had enacted. In his quiet acceptance, I found a form of absolution, not through law or confession, but through the simple human act of being understood. Here, in the arms of another survivor, I began to heal not fully, for some scars are eternal, but enough to recognize that life could continue, that love could flourish, and that justice, however unconventional, had been wrought. Our community of former slaves thrived on the edges of the larger Canadian society, bound together by mutual experience and vigilance. We celebrated the births, mourned the losses, and shared in the daily labor that sustained our lives. In the evenings, elders would recount tales of daring escapes, of masters undone by their own cruelty, and of the resilience that ran like fire through the veins of those who had been enslaved. I would listen, a quiet observer, seeing reflections of my own story in the stories of others, understanding that our collective memory was both a warning and a source of strength. As the years stretched onward, my children grew under the canopy of freedom. Their first steps into a world unshackled were tentative, yet they soon learned the rhythms of a life I had fought to secure. I taught them about the sacrifices required to claim liberty, about the cunning and patience necessary when confronting injustice. In our household, justice was not theoretical, it was the law of survival, the memory of Joseph, the echo of Thornhill's fate, and the enduring presence of Samuel's wisdom. Each lesson I imparted was layered with love, tempered with caution, and imbued with the knowledge that freedom must always be defended. Occasionally, I would dream of the mastiffs, their eyes reflecting the duality of their training, once instruments of oppression, now unwitting agents of vengeance. I hoped they had found peace in death, liberated from the cruelty they had once served. And I carried their memory as a testament to the truth I had learned, that even the most brutal forces could be redirected, that the cycle of violence could be interrupted, and that the human spirit, though battered and broken, retained the capacity for ingenuity, courage, and justice. In these quiet reflections, I understood that my journey had been more than survival or vengeance. It had been the crafting of a legacy, the establishment of a life where love and freedom could coexist with memory and justice. Each choice I had made, dangerous, terrifying, morally ambiguous, was part of the path that led to this porch, this garden, these children whose laughter filled the air like sunlight through the leaves. And so I watched them grow, carrying forward the spirit of those who had come before, instilling in them the belief that justice is neither simple nor evenly applied, that courage can take many forms, and that freedom, fragile, precious, and hard-won, is worth every sacrifice. I understood finally that vengeance had been a bridge to liberation, but life itself demanded more. Patience, love, and the ongoing commitment to ensure that the generations to come would know only the warmth of freedom, not the bite of oppression. The story of Thornhill Plantation became a ghost that haunted the South long after the mastiffs had scattered and the fog lifted. Tales spread by word of mouth, each retelling more sensational than the last. In neighboring plantations, whispers reached the ears of owners and overseers alike. A house slave had orchestrated a master's death using the very dogs bred to kill. Some dismissed it as fantasy, a cautionary tale spun by frightened witnesses. Others feared its truth and wondered if every act of cruelty might one day be returned, amplified, against them. I heard of these stories indirectly, carried by runaways who had fled Georgia and the Carolinas, seeking refuge in Canada or the northern states. Each account differed slightly. Some exaggerated the supernatural, calling me a conjure woman who had bewitched the dogs. Others framed Thornhill as the ultimate victim of his own hubris and brutality. Few recounted the quiet truth, that patience, observation, and a fierce determination had been the true instruments of justice. Each version, however, served a purpose. It reminded the enslaved that cunning, courage, and intelligence could invert the power structures meant to crush them. In my community, the tale became a whispered legend, recounted around fires and during shared meals. Elders used it as a lesson, showing the young that the enslaved were not powerless, that even under the yoke of oppression, the oppressed could find ways to fight back. I was careful not to place myself at the center of the story, allowing the legend to grow in the imaginations of those who heard it. My presence remained quiet, almost spectral, a symbol of resistance more than a living person to be scrutinized. Life in Canada continued, a mixture of ordinary labor and extraordinary freedom. Frederick and I watched our children grow under the protective canopy of liberty, teaching them the values that had guided our flight from bondage. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains, it was vigilance, community, and the careful cultivation of knowledge and skills that ensured survival. The past lingered in our lessons, in our stories, in the ways we navigated the world with caution and purpose. Occasionally, letters arrived from those still in the South or from travelers who had passed through, sharing news of the aftermath. Thornhill's widow had sold the plantation, unable to manage its grounds or the tarnished legacy of her husband's violent death. The remaining dogs, symbols of terror under Thornhill, had been destroyed or disappeared into rumor. The quarters where the enslaved had lived were burned, some said as retribution, others as an attempt to erase the memory of the plantation's dark acts. These accounts reached me like echoes from a past life, reminders that while I had escaped, the world I had left behind continued to shift and fracture under the weight of its own brutality. Through all this, Joseph remained a presence in my life, both memory and compass. His death had set my vengeance into motion, but his vision of freedom continued to guide me. Every action, every choice, was influenced by his memory, the North Star he had shown me as a child, guiding others in the dark, now guiding me through life itself. My efforts were no longer solely for survival or revenge, but for the cultivation of a legacy that honored those who had fallen before me. The years brought marriage, family, and community. Frederick's quiet strength complemented my resolve. His past experiences under bondage mirrored, yet differed from my own. Together, we formed a household that was both refuge and incubator for freedom's promise. Our children, born into a life they had not fought for, but must now understand, carried within them the seeds of resilience, courage, and memory. I taught them, subtly yet firmly, that freedom was fragile and precious, that justice could take unexpected forms, and that the stories of those who had resisted were as vital as the lessons of school or scripture. The settlement itself became a network of stories and guidance. Newly arrived escapees found shelter, food, and counsel. The elderly shared their experiences, instructing younger generations on the subtle arts of survival and navigation in a world that remained hostile beyond our borders. I participated quietly, often behind the scenes, offering what I could of skill, knowledge, and care. Though I no longer wielded the same power I had orchestrated at Thornhill, I understood that influence could manifest in quieter, yet enduring, ways. The legacy of that night, the bloodied revenge exacted upon Thornhill, remained a thread woven through every tale of resistance. It became a metaphor for balance in a world designed to deny it, a lesson that cruelty could be confronted, even if the cost was moral ambiguity. I recognized that the story would always be filtered through exaggeration, fear, and admiration, but that did not diminish its power. It had inspired other acts of defiance, small rebellions that, cumulatively, challenged the oppressive system piece by piece. Even in my later years, I reflected on the strange symmetry of justice, the way Thornhill's training had been turned against him, and how the dogs, tools of terror, had been instruments of retribution. I thought of Samuel, whose quiet wisdom had guided my actions, who had imparted knowledge without claiming credit, taking secrets to his grave. I mourned him in silence, alongside Joseph, giving thanks for their guidance and presence that had shaped the trajectory of my life. I understood fully that vengeance, while deeply personal, had become a statement beyond myself. It communicated to those enslaved that resistance was possible, that patience and cunning could overturn the expectations of power. It reminded those in power that cruelty carried consequences, that even carefully controlled instruments of domination could be subverted. This understanding shaped my worldview, infusing every choice I made for the rest of my life with awareness, care, and strategy. By the time my hair silvered and my hands bore the marks of decades of labor and survival, I had created a life I could be proud of. My children thrived, my community persisted, and the stories of resistance continued to circulate, quietly preserving the memory of those who had acted when the world offered no justice. Though I never returned to the United States, I remained acutely aware of its ongoing struggles, understanding that the path toward equality and freedom would be long and fraught. Yet in my corner of Canada, I had carved out a space of safety, dignity, and legacy. A home where the echoes of vengeance had transformed into a life of hope, resilience, and honor. Even as the seasons turned and my body aged, I felt the pull of the past not as chains, but as guidance. I would share Joseph's name with my children, the story of the dogs with those who could understand, and the principles of courage and ingenuity with anyone willing to learn. Thornhill's memory was a cautionary tale, yes, but also a testament to the power that could emerge from oppression when wielded with patience, intelligence, and moral clarity. In the end, the night of reckoning at Thornhill Plantation became not just my story, but part of a collective narrative, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, human agency could reshape destiny, and freedom could be claimed through wit, courage, and unflinching resolve. Years passed, yet the weight of that night at Thornhill Plantation never fully lifted. Even in freedom, even in a life built with Frederick and our children, the memory of orchestrating vengeance remained a cluster-day, constant presence, not as torment exactly, but as a silent companion reminding me of the cost of cruelty and the extent to which justice sometimes demands courage, cunning, and moral compromise. I often found myself standing on the porch of our modest home, watching the sun rise or set over the Canadian horizon, and letting my thoughts drift back to Georgia. I thought of Joseph, his smile, his hand in mine, and the North Star that had guided us both, literally and metaphorically, through the darkest nights. I remembered his laughter in the cabin, his whispered hopes for a life free from chains, his faith that I could survive, and perhaps even thrive, without him. His absence had been a gaping void, one I tried to fill with purpose, with planning, and ultimately with the act of vengeance that had brought symmetry to the brutality he endured. In my reflections, I realized that grief had been a teacher as much as it had been a wound. Grief sharpened my senses, honed my patience, and forced me to confront the raw reality of power, cruelty, and survival. Freedom, I learned, was not a single moment of release but a continuous practice, a deliberate choice each day to live, to protect, to nurture, and to build a life that honored the sacrifices of the past. In this practice, I discovered the delicate balance between remembrance and letting go. I spoke Joseph's name in the quiet of the night, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the chambers of my mind. I told him of our children, of the settlement, of the lives we had managed to carve out from the remnants of bondage. I confessed to him the moral weight I carried, the satisfaction and horror mingled inextricably at the memory of Thornhill's death. In philosophical moments, I considered the nature of justice itself. In a world built to protect cruelty, where laws enshrined ownership of human bodies and permitted unimaginable suffering, traditional notions of justice were meaningless to those of us enslaved. And yet, human conscience cannot endure without some sense of balance. My act had restored balance in the only way possible, through cunning and patience, turning the very instruments of oppression back upon their creator. It was justice outside the law, justice measured not in fines or imprisonment, but in the tangible consequences of deliberate cruelty. The dogs, trained for violence, became agents of karmic symmetry. Thornhill, in his final moments, experienced the terror and helplessness he had so casually inflicted on others. I often meditated on the transformation I had enacted not only upon Thornhill, but upon myself. In seeking revenge, I found agency, a reclamation of self that had been denied in every other sphere of my existence. Yet this agency came at a moral cost. Taking a human life, no matter how deserved, leaves traces on the soul. I carried those traces, acknowledged them, and allowed them to temper my understanding of justice. It was a reminder that power, even when reclaimed, must be wielded with awareness, and that the consequences of violence are never entirely contained. The stories of Thornhill's death, as they spread, were interpreted differently depending on who heard them. Some called me a heroine, a symbol of resistance and resilience. Others whispered of witchcraft or demonic cunning. Both interpretations, in their way, were true. They captured the awe and fear that arises when the powerless assert control, when intelligence and courage overturn systems designed to enforce submission. I accepted these tales as they came, neither confirming nor denying, understanding that the story itself had become a living testament to the possibilities of resistance beyond the confines of my own life. I reflected also on the dogs themselves, the instruments of cruelty, who had become instruments of justice. In their obedience, in their primal adherence to conditioned commands, they mirrored the world around them. Taught to kill the helpless, they had, instead, been made to confront the cruel. The lesson resonated far beyond Thornhill Plantation. Even those shaped by brutality, when guided with intelligence and purpose, could be turned toward a higher function, toward justice, rather than oppression. There was a profound symmetry in this, a poetic closure that the human heart recognizes even in the absence of formal law. Raising our children, I imparted these subtle lessons: vigilance, courage, intelligence, and moral discernment. I told them of Joseph, of the sacrifices made for freedom, and of the ways in which justice sometimes required acts beyond conventional morality. But I framed these truths with care, ensuring that they understood context, choice, and the weight of responsibility. Freedom was precious, but it demanded constant awareness and deliberate action. They learned that the world could be cruel, but that courage and cleverness could create pathways through the most formidable obstacles. In quieter moments, I acknowledged my own transformation. The woman who had orchestrated Thornhill's death was not the same as the widow who fled Georgia. Each act, each choice, each encounter along the path north had shaped a self that was resilient, deliberate, and cautious, yet capable of love and care. Frederick's presence, steady and unwavering, reminded me that vulnerability was not weakness. The creation of a home, the nurturing of children, and the building of community were acts of courage and resistance, just as potent as the planning of vengeance. Ultimately, my reflections coalesced into a profound understanding that life and justice are not linear, that freedom requires both action and wisdom, and that agency is born from observation, patience, and courage. Thornhill's death was a violent punctuation, a closing of one chapter, but my life beyond it had to be constructed with intention, grounded in care and awareness, and guided by the memory of those who had suffered and fought before me. In the end, I found peace not in forgetting the cruelty, not in erasing the acts of vengeance, but in integrating them into a coherent narrative of survival, justice, and legacy. I learned that justice can be multifaceted, that vengeance can coexist with love and hope, and that the choices we make in the darkest hours shape not only our own destiny, but the lives of those who follow. Standing on the porch of our modest home, listening to the laughter of children and the rustle of leaves in the wind, I realized that freedom was a continuum, one born from courage, hardened by loss, and sustained by the deliberate acts of those who refused to accept oppression as inevitable. In that awareness, I could breathe fully, carry forward the legacy of Joseph and Samuel, and guide our children into a future where they could live not just as survivors, but as empowered, free human beings. The night at Thornhill Plantation remained, vivid and instructive, a reminder that even in the bleakest circumstances, choice, cunning, and courage could bend fate toward justice, and that freedom, though hard-won, was always worth the effort. The years stretched on, and the seasons cycled in a rhythm that was at once comforting and relentless. Winter's harsh grip gave way to spring, and with each renewal, the world around me felt subtly more alive than the last. The small settlement in Canada became home, not just a refuge from slavery, but a place where life could be nurtured and the seeds of hope could grow. Frederick and I worked side by side. Our bond deepened not by the absence of struggle but by the shared understanding of its weight. In the quiet moments of the evening, as we sat together watching the children play in the yard, I felt the strange, powerful mixture of peace and vigilance that life after slavery demands. Our children grew strong, their laughter ringing through the settlement like a bell of defiance against the world we had left behind. They were born free, yet I never allowed them to forget the cost of that freedom. Stories of Joseph, of Thornhill, and of the sacrifices that had carved a path for our lives were shared with care, not to instill fear but to cultivate resilience and understanding. Freedom was not merely a gift to be received, it was a responsibility to be honored, defended, and lived with purpose. I watched my children develop curiosity, courage, and compassion, traits nurtured in a home that had been forged in the crucible of survival. Each small triumph, from the first words read aloud to the first garden planted, felt like a personal victory against the world that had sought to claim our bodies and spirits. In the quiet mornings, I often revisited the memories of Thornhill Plantation. The fog, the baying of the hounds, the terror on Thornhill's face, all of it remained vivid, a testament to the life that had been stolen and the justice that had been wrought. I thought of Samuel, who had guided me with his quiet wisdom, and I whispered thanks to his memory, a daily ritual of remembrance and gratitude. The shadows of the past were never far, but they no longer held dominion over me. They were tools, reminders, lessons, not chains. Through the settlement, I encountered others who had walked similar paths, freedmen and women, runaways, and their descendants, all weaving together a tapestry of survival and resistance. We shared stories, exchanged knowledge, and celebrated milestones with a depth of understanding that only those who had known oppression could grasp. The community became a network not just of safety but of empowerment, a living testament to the resilience of our people. Every handshake, every shared meal, every whispered warning of danger was a thread in the fabric of freedom we collectively created. Frederick and I, bound by love and mutual respect, became mentors to the younger generation. I taught them to read and write, to cultivate the land, to respect the value of work, and, most importantly, to understand that freedom is an active state, not a passive one. I told them stories of strategy, of courage, and of moral complexity. I told them about the night at Thornhill, careful to convey both the pain and the necessity of the choices I had made. They learned that justice is sometimes hidden, sometimes harsh, and that courage often comes disguised as fearlessness in the face of impossible odds. Though I had built a life of stability and love, the shadows of vengeance and survival remained intertwined with my daily existence. I often reflected on the strange balance I had achieved, where the act of orchestrating Thornhill's end had liberated not only my body but my spirit. The dogs, instruments of cruelty, had become symbols of reclaimed power. Thornhill's death was a punctuation in the narrative of injustice, but the story of life, family, and community that followed became the ongoing testament to resilience. I realized that justice is not always linear. It does not always follow the rules of law or morality as defined by the powerful. It often emerges from the patient, courageous, and intelligent choices of those who refuse to accept oppression as inevitable. In moments of solitude, I allowed myself to imagine the life we might leave for our children, a life of possibility, unshackled by the chains that had once bound us. I pictured them growing into adults who would carry not only the memory of slavery but the lessons of survival, intelligence, and justice. I wanted them to understand that freedom carries with it the weight of responsibility, that the choices one makes in the face of cruelty define not just the individual, but the community, the lineage, and even the broader arc of history. Our home became a sanctuary of learning and laughter, of grief transformed into strength. The stories I shared were not solely of horror and vengeance, but of courage, cunning, and the undying pursuit of a life that could be fully lived. I watched as the younger generation began to take their first steps into a world that, though still flawed, offered opportunities that had been unimaginable only a decade before. And in those moments, I understood that the final act of vengeance, while shaping the past, had also shaped the future. It had carved space for growth, for love, for freedom unthreatened by the lash, the auction block, or the master's cruel whims. I thought often of the dogs and the lessons they embodied, not inherently cruel, but shaped by those who wielded power irresponsibly. They became the instruments of justice when guided by intelligence and moral clarity. Their transformation mirrored my own journey from subjugation to agency, from grief to strategic action, from silence to a voice capable of reshaping destiny. Looking out over the settlement, I realized that life is a continuum where the past and present intertwine, and where the choices of one generation echo into the next. I had learned that even in the darkest circumstances, one can find a path to light through intelligence, patience, and courage. I had discovered that freedom, though fragile, is a treasure worth every risk, every hardship, and every act of moral courage. And in this realization, I found hope, a hope I could pass to my children and to those who would come after them. As the sun rose on another day, painting the valley in hues of gold and green, I felt the weight of the past settle into a place of understanding rather than burden. I whispered a prayer for Joseph, for Samuel, for Frederick, for the children, and even, in a strange sense, for Thornhill, whose death had, against all odds, set the stage for life beyond cruelty. The wind carried my words across the fields, and I imagined them settling into the hearts of those yet to come, carrying with them the knowledge that justice, freedom, and courage can coexist, even when born from the shadows of unimaginable pain. And with that, I turned toward the horizon, ready to continue the work of life, of love, of freedom, and of hope, carrying with me the memory of vengeance, the lessons of survival, and the unshakable belief that even the darkest nights can give way to the promise of dawn.